It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Adrian Liston. Professor Liston did his PhD from Australian National University while studying T-cell tolerance in diabetes, and the PhD studies were followed by the postdoctoral research on Treg cells, regulatory T cells with Professor Sasha Rudinsky at University of Washington. And he was a PI in Belgium between 2009 to 18 at University of Leuven, and then he relocated in 2019 to Babraham Institute, Cambridge, UK. Professor Liston has been awarded many awards, including the Appendoff Prize, the Wellcome Trust Investigator Award, and 3 ERC grants. And currently his research interest is in understanding the interaction of immune system and tissues, in particular the brain. Recently, Professor Liston has been elected a fellow of Academy of Medical Sciences in the UK for his pioneering research in immunology and neuroimmunology. And he's also a fellow of Academy of Medical Sciences. And these fellows are elected for the exceptional contribution to medical science, either in form of original discovery or of sustained contribution to scholarship. And today he will speak about a cynic's guide to getting a faculty position and succeeding in it. So Professor Adrian Liston, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Now, if I can just share my screen, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I was asked to talk about my scientific career. So you're going to get a N=1 scientific career overview for how my career went by. Of course, everyone's career is completely unique. So I think you can learn some lessons from listening to people talk about their career, but don't feel like there is only one pathway to success. In my experience, biomedical postdocs, biomedical PhDs overwhelmingly have successful careers. It's not always the careers that they expected to be successful in, but they almost always end up being highly successful. Okay, so this is my career pathway. So first of all, where does my perspective come from? I was born in 1980 in Adelaide, which is a city in Australia. I was born into a truck driving family and no one around me had finished high school. So I didn't have an academic family. I'm definitely a first generation academic. And one of the things about growing up working class is from your peers, you get tall poppy syndrome. This is, at least in Australia, the idea that, you know, if you try hard at school and you want to go to university, that you think you're better than everyone else and people try to pull you down. At the same time, you get class snobbery from above. You know, oh, what did your dad do? Oh, he drives trucks. You know, you're not one of us. So I think it is tough breaking into an academic career if you're from a working class background or a poor background. The advantage though, is if you do make it against the odds, I think you've got the resilience that helps you deal with setbacks in science. You know, science is a brutal career. You're constantly dealing with failure and negative feedback. And I think if you have got into science from a position of adversity, it makes you more immune to just the constant failures and setbacks. That is part of a normal scientific career. So my inspiration for going into science was from David Attenborough. The documentaries that he had on nature were basically my entire exposure to science as a kid. And I just loved watching these nature documentaries. So I stayed in high school and went to university, and that was my rationale for going into science. So this is more or less my career pathway. I started at the local university, which is the University of Adelaide. I did my undergraduate degree, which is a 3-year course in Adelaide, followed by a 1-year honours degree. This is a research degree, which is like a short master's degree. I did this in the Sean McColl lab, and I was studying a model of multiple sclerosis, the involvement of T cells in multiple sclerosis. I was able to publish my honours work, but as you can see from the dates, the publication was 8 years after I finished in the lab. So sometimes papers have got a very long cooking time before they finally come out. Now, during my honours year, this really nice paper was published in Journal of Experimental Medicine by a group in Canberra in Australia. And I was reading this paper and I just found it absolutely fascinating. And so I wrote a short email to the last author saying that I really liked the paper and I thought it was really interesting and had they thought of doing X, Y, or Z. And he basically emailed me back a day later. We had a 30-minute phone call and he offered me a PhD in Canberra. So, you know, talking to people that you like their papers, giving them feedback and engaging with them can be a pathway to getting a next position. So that's when I moved to Canberra, to the Australian National University for my PhD. The Australian PhD system is quite short. It's a 3-year program. So I stayed for my PhD, which was only 2.5 years, I think, but then I stayed in the lab for an extra year as a postdoc. During that last period of my PhD, I also did a graduate certificate in higher education because I was at that point very interested in becoming an academic. So I wanted to learn about higher education as a system and how to mentor in higher education. So what did I do in my PhD? Well, basically, I was looking at T-cell tolerance processes. So in the thymus, you have got T-cells are learning what antigens are self and what antigens are not self. And at this point, we didn't really understand how that was working. Now, I was fortunate to work on the gene AIR, very famous for its discovery in Finland, and as being a disease-causing gene in people with autoimmune polyendocrinopathy syndrome type 1. So my work was basically focused on the gene AIR, showing how it can upregulate antigens that are present in the thymus. And then this, antigens that are normally present in the periphery, it can make them also present in the thymus. And then this allows negative selection and purging of the autoimmune repertoire. So it was a very successful PhD from terms of publications. I had quite a few good first author publications working on this topic. And I also was able to get a last author publication by taking on an honours student and mentoring them during my 1-year postdoc. So in terms of my PhD as a career step, there are certainly some things that I did right and some things that I did wrong. So things I did right, I was willing to move. Having mobility is really helpful in science. It gives you so many more options. I also picked a topic that I was genuinely interested in. I really liked the science that was going on, and so I was able to be motivated by my science, and I think that's critical. I also picked a promoter who was a very creative scientist. Chris Goodnow is a fantastic scientist, and so working with someone who's creative and always comes up with interesting ideas is a very positive move. On the other hand, I didn't interview him in person. It was really a half-an-hour phone call, no more than that. I didn't talk to anyone else in the lab. And so I could have walked blind into a bad situation. And really, it was luck that it was a good fit, because I don't really think there is such a thing as a good lab. There are labs that fit particular people. And for me, by luck, this lab really fit me. But other people going into the same lab had much worse experiences because everyone has got personal needs that are going to be easier or harder to get fulfilled in different labs. I went to a top level lab, which is a great career step, but I was also in a mid-level institute. So few of my peers from back then are now group leaders. And I focused on getting top papers. I think that is an absolutely key step of an academic career, getting a large paper in a major journal that's going to be read. And if I could give one piece of advice to you, it's that the Finnish system of salami slicing papers into multiple small papers is not good for your career. I know that there are requirements to have certain numbers of papers before you finish your PhD, but the problem is if you take a very interesting story and slice it into 4 small papers, people don't read the full story. And it is very hard to sell that in your career. You're much better off having fewer papers that have a complete story that's easier to get people to read and easier for people to notice and to see that your contribution is there. So I think that's really, really critical, especially for people in the Finnish system, to focus on getting a complete story in a paper. Now, something I did wrong is I didn't really go out of my comfort zone to learn difficult techniques. I've never been a great wet lab scientist. There are a few things I learned how to do, and I was able to get some really great publications doing the techniques that I knew. And a couple of times I tried to push myself out of my comfort zone, but basically I got scared off because it wasn't as productive as when I was inside my comfort zone. And in retrospect, I wish I had stayed, I wish I had gone further and learned harder techniques. And I learned management skills through my graduate certificate in higher education, which came to help me later on. The other thing, though, is that I graduated too early. So I graduated 2.5 years into my PhD because I could, you know, I had the papers. And in retrospect, a lot of the career fellowship clocks start ticking from your date of your PhD. So it would have been much better for my career if I had had a longer PhD rather than graduate early and turn into a postdoc and then finish up extra papers as a postdoc. I think the date of your PhD as late as possible will end up helping you down the track. Now, partway through my PhD, this really key paper came out on regulatory T cells. This is one of the first papers on FOXP3 driving the development of regulatory T cells from the Rudinsky lab. Really key paper in the field. And I read this paper and straight away emailed Sasha Rudinsky and said, I'm really interested in this topic. Could I come and join your lab? He said, you know, come and have a visit. I went and visited. We probably spent about half an hour together. And then I wrote a fellowship and came to move to his lab for a postdoc. So I then postdoced in the University of Washington for about 3 years. During this postdoc, I became quite unhappy with science and how it was working. I didn't really enjoy the hyper competitiveness of working in a major T-Reg lab at the start of that field. And so I started looking for alternative careers. And one thing I looked at is a career in public health. So I started during the weekends doing a master's in public health correspondence through the University of Queensland. So I was doing the master's on the weekend and my postdoc during the week. So what was my postdoc on? Well, essentially it was on the basic requirements for regulatory T cells, how the regulatory T cells are made in the thymus, how they need to encounter their self-antigens, and then what increases the number of regulatory T cells out in the periphery. So these are things that are all quite well established now, but at that time, basically every question on regulatory T cells was a new question. I had 3 papers from the labs, quite good journals, JXMed, PNAS, although in the Rudinsky lab, everyone published in these journals, and it was certainly a step below some of the other work that was coming out of the lab at that time. So what did I do right and wrong as a postdoc? Well, in terms of things I did right, again, I was willing to move. And again, I picked a topic that I was interested in. One thing that I think is quite useful when looking for a postdoc is I looked at the ratio of postdocs to top papers. There are some labs that get a Nature paper every year, but they also have 40 postdocs. And if you think about the chance of success, it's actually quite bad. In the Rudinsky lab, though, if you look at the size of the lab at that time, about 10 people, and they were getting 3 good papers a year, it meant that more or less everyone going in on average was getting a good paper every 3 years. So that ratio of postdocs to top papers, I think, is a very useful metric for seeing the labs that are actually very good at a per postdoc level versus the labs that are just enormous. And I had a very successful promoter. Sasha Rudinsky is one of the world's leading immunologists. On the other hand, there are also things I did wrong here. I didn't look at the career of past lab members. I think for a senior investigator, it can be quite useful to have a look at where their previous postdocs have gone. Have they stayed in academia? Have they left academia and moved to industry? It tells you something about how that lab sets people up. And also, while my mentor, Sastrudinsky, was a very successful scientist, I think we were quite incompatible as a mentor and mentee. And there were some people there that had very successful relationships. And for me, it didn't work. So again, I don't think it's such a thing about a good lab or a bad lab. It's just about the fit being wrong. Again, I joined a top level lab that really helps your career a lot. But it was a mid-level institute. So there are a few of my peers there who are now group leaders, but it's not the same as if you had gone to Stanford or Yale, where so many people around you end up being group leaders. Again, I focused on getting top tier papers, but I still stayed in my technical comfort zone. I didn't learn new techniques, and I wanted to get out fast because I wasn't enjoying it. So I did focus too much on getting the next paper with the minimal barriers, rather than trying to build up the best possible story. So that's something that I did wrong. I got grant writing experience from fellowships, which is certainly helpful later on in my career. And I realized that the lab was a bad environment for me, so I started to study a Plan B career, which was my master's in public health. So this led to the big question: should I stay or should I go? And there are certainly reasons for me to stay in science, and there's certainly reasons for me to leave academic science and go do another career. So in terms of why I wanted to stay, I love science. I wanted to be independent scientist. I wanted to be a mentor. And I wasn't really that interested in the Masters in Public Health. On the other hand, I hated running experiments. I just really didn't like being a wet lab scientist. I didn't want to do another postdoc because it didn't really fit me. And the idea of starting that again and doing that another 5 years as a postdoc was just not going to happen for me. On the other hand, I was too young really to get a lab head position. I was 28 years old, and there are very few people who get a lab head position at that age. I hadn't developed a broad technical skill set, and I didn't really want to succeed if it meant being a shark, constantly looking for opportunities and competing hard with everyone around you. That wasn't how I wanted to live. So my solution was, I'll try one round of professorship applications, and if I'm not successful, I'll leave science and move to public health. So I put out many applications. I had a bunch of failures. I had a couple of successes, and one of those was a position I took up in Belgium at the VIB and University of Leuven. So I started my lab there in 2009, had a child, Hayden, in 2011, and I was there in the University of Leuven and VIB for 10 years before recently moving my group over to the Babraham Institute at the University of Cambridge. So in terms of why I got a position, I think there are things that helped and there are things that hindered. One thing that helped is I had multiple top tier publications. I had a big paper in Nature Immunology and Immunity from my PhD. I had some solid papers from my postdoc in JXMed. I had a last author publication in Immunity from my PhD, working with my PhD supervisor. On the other hand, I didn't have Nature Science Cell papers like some of the people coming out of the Rudinsky lab had. And also, my best papers were mostly from my PhD. They were really the top tier papers. And then my postdoc papers were more solid papers that were getting into good journals because of my supervisor and because the field is very topical in those years. It helped that I had a management and teaching ethos. And this is from my graduate certificate in higher education. If people asked me about my thoughts on mentoring, my thoughts on education, I had an answer prepared because I'd spent a couple of years looking into these questions. And I think that particularly helped me because I was much younger than normal for a professor. And I think a lot of people basically thought I wasn't ready yet to be a professor, but when I got into interviews, I was able to convince them that I had that maturity because I had the management and teaching ethos. I had grant writing experience from a fellowship that was certainly helped. And I've always been quite good at having creative ideas, so that helped. I didn't train at a top tier institute, so that's always a little bit of a hindrance, but I think it's not as important as training in a top lab. Oh, and one thing that I thought I put on here, but I didn't, is having a Y chromosome. And I think if you don't understand that men have an unearned advantage, then you're just not paying attention. Okay, so key tips for you to apply if you're interested in becoming a group leader. First of all, I would say you got to build your application. That job committee is going to want someone who can come up with ideas, they can raise funding, and they can execute the ideas. So how do you show that you can raise funding before you're actually raising funding? You can't apply for large grants as a postdoc. And the trick is to start building the record now with small prizes and fellowships. So many travel grants have success rates close to 100% because many postdocs don't apply. Poster prizes are great. Company awards for free reagents are great. Fellowships are fantastic. Because all of these small grants, they basically show that you've got a record of getting funding, and people like to give funding to people who have got funding. It is very circular reasoning, but it's the way that you can get in is with these little small prizes. In terms of being able to execute the ideas, really past performance is the best indicator of future success. So you want to show that you can execute your ideas by showing that you've done this in the past. And this is really through first author or co-first author research publications. That's your currency that you're after. Now, in terms of what does it take in terms of publications to get a position, I would say that generally 2 to 4 first author research articles of substance is more or less the minimum. The trick is, what does of substance mean? And here it's up to you to make the case. You can frame the case any way you want because you're writing the CV. So you can emphasize anything that you want. Are you publishing in top-level journals? You can emphasize the journals. Do you have maybe a publication in a minor journal, but with many, many citations? Well, then emphasize citations. Have you made a novel technique that's been used by a lot of other people? Well, then emphasize that. Maybe it was covered by News and Views, maybe it had patents. Whatever makes you look good, that is the frame that you want to sell your CV through. The other thing I'd say is that if you're successful in multiple locations, that starts to be good evidence that you're the winning ingredient rather than your lab being the winning ingredient. Now, writing the application, just a few points on the CV. A generic CV is not a good CV. Your CV really should be tailored towards the institute that you're going to and the science that you want to do. And you should be selling a narrative about your track record that is consistent with your project and consistent with the position that you're applying for. And this narrative should have deliberate trajectory. It's very easy to tell me where you went, but you don't want to look like a leaf that is just meandering with the current, even if that's how your career went. Instead, rewrite your career so that it looks deliberate, as if 10 years ago, you knew that you want to apply for this particular position, and highlight what it is about your background that prepared you over the last 10 years for this position. And one of the things that I think can be quite useful is triangulation. So for example, for me, I wanted to do a proposal in genetics of regulatory T cells. So I emphasized in my PhD that I did a lot of immune genetics. And then I emphasized that I did a lot of regulatory T cells in my postdoc so that I could triangulate those two areas of expertise, making them my own area that wasn't going to be in the shadow of my previous two mentors. And to some degree, of course, this is going to be true, but another way is about what you choose to emphasize in your different positions. I could easily have emphasized the immunology rather than the genetics in my PhD. But for the strategy of the application, I emphasize the genetics. Now, in terms of one really final tip is that you have to apply. And you probably don't feel ready. And honestly, you're not ready. None of us are ready because we're never going to get the ability to be a group leader until we're a group leader already. It's one of those things that you're not saying, I know how to do this job. You're saying, I'm ready to learn how on the job. Do not hold yourself back. You should apply anyway, because no one is ever going to come to you and say, you're ready now, here's the job. It doesn't work like that. You need to apply, you need to fight for it, and you need to work the system. And don't be fazed by rejections. Honestly, the best applications in the world will have a 50% rejection rate. Do not feel rejected by this rejection. It's just a game of roulette at this stage. Success rates of about 10%, I think, are quite normal for good people applying in realistic, for realistic positions. And this makes it hard if you're not mobile. If you're in a place where there are really only 2 universities and you can't move, that 10% acceptance rate is going to make the whole thing quite difficult. And one final point is that you really need to sell yourself. And I think from an Australian background and also from a European background, we don't like selling ourselves. We don't feel comfortable with it. But the reality is, if you don't sell yourself, who's going to sell you? You have to be out there, you have to put on your performing hat and convince the jury that you're the right person for this job. And with that, I'd like to say good luck. There's a few further resources in case you're interested in this talk. We just recently wrote an article on how to apply for junior faculty positions that you can find in Stroke, and a second article on how to start up your independent research lab once you get a position. If you're interested in parenting as a scientist, I had an eLife interview a few years back on how I managed being a parent and a scientist. If you're interested in sexism and hiring panels, I gave a seminar for Athena Swan that if you're interested in, you can look at. And if you're interested in getting a faculty position, then I've also got another seminar that I've put on YouTube for that. And I can put some of these in the chat, or maybe they can be emailed out to the audience after this talk. Thank you.